Hey folks, and welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. Today we're taking a look at a whole bunch of Schiit products because I've got what I would call the Schiit micro range here. And apologies that I still have to censor the use of the word Schiit on the channel. It's just part of YouTube's recent changes to their rules and regulations for advertising and monetization. So apologies for that. I'm going to try and use the word as little as possible, but I do need to refer to the fact that I've got all of Schiit's new, what I would call their micro range here. So that means I've got the Magni Plus, the Magni Heretic, the Modi Plus, and the new Modi Multibit 2. As a bonus down the bottom here, I've also got the collaboration between Schiit and Nitsch, and that's the Piety amp, which is essentially a retuned version of the Magni Plus as I understand it. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on the Piety, but I will talk about it and how it compares to the other two for those that are interested. What I'm going to do before we launch into the Glamour video is give you a quick introduction of these. And specifically what we've got here is the Schiit Modi Plus. This is a compact DAC coming in at $129. Underneath that in the black, we've got the Modi Multibit 2. That comes in at $299. It's still the same form factor, but it has got some differences, and it's a multi-bit DAC. It's the entry-level multi-bit DAC from Schiit. I'm going to explain what multi-DAC versus the regular Delta Sigma DAC is all about shortly. And then with the amps, we've got the Magni Heretic, which has got the red colouring here, and we've also got the regular Magni Plus, which is the regular silver and grey. And both of these are priced exactly the same at $109 US. Now, of course, pricing is based on the timing of the review. If it changes in the future, which I know Schiit try to avoid, but if it does change in the future, that's the pricing as of the time of this review, and that's February 2023. I say that not because I'm expecting there to be an increase in pricing, but just because these things happen, and this is a product being brand new that might live for a while, so you never know. Now, before I get into any greater details on these products, I'm going to give you a chance to take a look at the Glamour video because it's going to show you some of the similarities, differences, and design points that I'm then going to talk about after.
Lost my phone, and I don't know where to go. My friends are getting stoned, somewhere on the boat.
Alright, let's go through a tour of each of the devices, and I might start with the amps because they're very, very simple, and that's because they're all the same externally. On the inside there are differences in the circuits, and I'll explain that in a second as well, but let's start with a quick tour of the physical connections, the ins, the outs, etc. Whether you've got the Piety, the Magni Plus, or the Magni Heretic, they've all got a simple volume knob, 6.3mm output, and in the case of the Magni Plus and the Magni Heretic, you've also got a gain switch. The Piety doesn't have gain, it's just a single gain unit, and I'm not going to get into how well that gain works compared to the switchability. The Piety is really only here for sound quality. And for those not familiar with the Piety, the reason for that is, as I understand it, it was a limited run. It's not a product you can go and buy today. So I'm just giving people context if they own the Piety and they're wondering how the other two Schiit amps compare, or maybe they just want to know the full range of whether they missed out on something with the Piety compared to what they already own, what they should have bought, what they might be buying, all that stuff. That's why the Piety's here. But I'm going to talk about the products that are readily available mostly and just throw the Piety in for some colour. So speaking mostly about the Heretic and the Magni Plus, you've got the three-way gain switch, low, medium, high, volume knob, and 6.3mm output. So these are pure single-ended amps, there's no balanced. If we flip around to the back, you've got a power input, you've got the good old power switch on the back of Schiit devices, you've got a pair of RCA outputs for the preamp, those are controlled by the volume knob, and they do switch with the input or removal of the 6.3mm jack. And then of course we've got RCA inputs for the signal coming in, and that's it. Both amps are absolutely identical as you can see here. Front panel the same, back panel the same. What's different is on the inside. And just really briefly, what's going on there is that the Magni Plus, let me check which one it is, the Magni Plus in the grey here, this is the one that has a discrete design internally, meaning that your components are all individual. You've got transistors, capacitors, resistors, operating as the amplification circuit for the device. When we go to the Magni Heretic, here we've got chip-based op-amps doing the amplification process. So basically those transistors, capacitors, resistors that are all individual in the original Magni Plus, in the Heretic, those become a single chip that integrates all those parts. And there's pros and cons to both. Generally what you'll find is the op-amp based devices, they will measure better. Some people like the sound of them because they can have a slightly more forward sort of sound. They can push the details a little bit, which can be preferable. But then when you go to a discrete design, those will generally give you a better sense of things like layering and depth in the soundstage, and they'll also sometimes give you a slightly more organic kind of sound. That's not a hard and fast rule, and we're going to talk about it in the context of the Magni Plus and the Heretic shortly, but that's generally a rule of thumb what to expect when you go from a discrete design to an integrated design or vice versa. But let's park the conversation about sound quality there for a moment. I'll come back around and do a full comparison of how they sound, how they compare to the Piety, etc. in a little while. But the final thing I want to mention about the Magnis is that you've got a wonderful range of capability from these, whether it's the Heretic or it's the Magni Plus. In each case, you've got an excellent range of gain control. What I understand is basically the short-lived IE Magni, which I loved when I reviewed it on the channel, that's kind of influenced what's happened with the Magni Plus and the Magni Heretic, which is to say that you've now got a negative gain mode, a zero gain mode, which is the middle gain, and a high gain mode, which is a positive gain. And that's great. If you're using IEMs, you might want to use the negative gain. If you're using most headphones, you're probably going to stick with the middle gain. But if you've got something difficult, you can crank it up to high gain and drive pretty much anything you can think of. Both of the current Magni options will give you 2.4 watts into a 32 ohm load, and that's heaps. That means that technically you can drive Susvaras with these. It doesn't mean you should, they're not at the performance level that the Susvara deserves, but in terms of pure power output, they've absolutely got enough, and that means they've got enough for any headphone on the planet. And so that kind of sums up your introduction to the Magni Plus range. We've got a discrete amp in the Magni Plus, an integrated design using op-amps for the amplification in the Magni Heretic, but other than that, both are identical. We've got power input, preamp output, signal input. The preamp out is switchable by the 6.3mm sockets and it's controlled by the volume, so there's no straight line out option. And you've got 3 gain modes to choose from. And so let's pause talking about the Magnis there and now talk about the matching Modi DACs. And there are some significant differences between these two. Let's start with a couple of things that are identical, and that is that they both will handle up to 192 kHz and 24-bit signals. So yes, there's still no DSD or high sample rate PCM from the Schiit DACs. That's a choice they've made and they so far are sticking with. That might change in the future. In my recent interview with Jason Stoddard from Schiit, he did talk about the fact that they are looking at upgrading their USB interface, which is their own interface. They are looking to upgrade that so it can take higher sample rates, so maybe in the future, but for now it's 122 kHz and 24-bit, regardless of which DAC you choose. If I flip both DACs around, the other similarities are also pretty obvious, and that is that we've got RCA output from both of them. There's no volume control, it's just a line out. You've got a coaxial input on both, an optical input on both, and a USB-C input on both. And that's where things now start to differ. If we then move over and look at the Modi, which is on the top, that being the Modi Plus, the Modi Plus also has a USB-C power input, whereas the Modi Multibit has a barrel connector for a DC input and a power switch. And so what that means is if you buy yourself the Modi Plus, it's going to come with a little wall wart for like a phone charger for 5V output through USB, and that's going to plug directly into the power socket, the USB-C power socket. You can also drive this direct from power that goes into the signal socket, so it's just about having a separated power supply versus just using the one going through USB. I'll leave that up to you. I did play around with it and I think Schiit have done a great job of minimizing the impact of the power signal on the DAC itself. So if you are just using power through the USB socket that takes the signal, it still sounds pretty good. But for those that want the absolute purest possible sound, you might want to use the external power supply with the external power socket. If we put down the Modi Plus for a moment though, and look at the Modi Multibit 2, what you'll see on the back of this one is we've now got the barrel connector and you've got the power switch here. So this comes with a dedicated wall wart to provide a higher voltage going in there. And that doesn't necessarily make it good or better or worse or anything else, it's just different and I wanted to flag it. I'm not really clear on why they chose to put a power switch on the Multibit 2 and they didn't put one on the Modi Plus. That's curious to me. But either way, that's the way it's been designed and so that's what you get. Just like with the amplifiers, there's some internal differences of course with the Multibit 2 and the Modi Plus, and that's specifically that in the case of the Multibit 2, what you've got going on in here is Schiit's own proprietary DAC technology, where they're using a medical grade analog to digital converter and using some tricks to make it work for audio. And if you want to know much more about that, do check out my recent interview with Jason Stoddard where we were talking all things digital to do with how Schiit produces their DACs. There's an explanation in there in brief terms about the multibit approach from Schiit. And then if we have a look at the regular Modi Plus, that's a more traditional DAC. When I say traditional, it's what most of us are used to, particularly at this price point, which is that it's an off-the-shelf DAC chip doing the decoding. Specifically, it's an ES9018 chip in the case of the Modi Plus. And that's a fairly old DAC chip now, but that shouldn't mean too much. I've heard older DAC chips clearly outperform newer ones based on how they've been implemented, so don't let that turn you off at all. And so I think at this point we've covered off everything you need to know about the design, the features, the functionality of these. One thing I didn't mention because it's such a simple front panel is that on the DACs, you've just got a single button on the front for cycling through your inputs. But beyond that, I think I've covered off everything you need to know about these other than how they sound. And so we're going to jump into that now, and I'm going to break it down and go through it in gradual steps. We're going to start at the top of the chain and talk about the DACs, and then work our way to the amps. Trying to work out what gear you should buy next? Have a look at the Passion for Sound Recommends link down in the description below. Clicking on the link will take you through to my Patreon page, and specifically a post where you can click on the Airtable image to go through to my recommended product database. Once you're in the database, you can use the filter button up the top to choose which sorts of product types you want to have a look at, maybe headphones, maybe DACs, maybe amps. Choose the one or ones that you want to see from this list, and then you can also sort the list by price if you want to, or other features as well. You'll then see a consolidated list just of the product types you want to have a look at, including things like what the retail price was when I last checked. You've got links to my reviews of each product, and then also links to where you can go and buy them. Feel free to play around with the filters and sorting options as much as you like to find the gear you're looking for, and I hope that this database points you in just the right direction for you. So happy hunting, happy listening, and now let's get back to the review. And so let's start things off with a comparison between the Modi Plus and the Modi Multibit 2. I'm not going to start off by talking about how each of them sound in isolation. I'm going to jump straight into comparing them two because you'll get a pretty good picture of both of them through that process. One thing I will say is that both DACs are generally quite neutral. There is a bit of coloration difference between them, which we'll get to in a second, but overall neither of them strike me as being vastly different tonally. And that's also to say that neither of them are particularly harsh, particularly warm. They sit somewhere in the middle ground. The most obvious thing I noticed as I jumped back and forth between the two was the difference in staging. The Modi Plus gives you a fairly flat left to right stage, whereas when you go over to the Modi Multibit 2, it's like the exact same staging, but the sides are just folded in a bit. And what that means, it may sound like that makes it congested and smaller, but it does a couple of things. One of them is it gives you a greater sense of depth in the soundstage because now you've got references that are closer to you on the left and the right compared to the central references that go back a bit. So you get a sense of depth and a sense of layering, but also gives you what I find to be a more natural spherical style soundstage. Something else that I noticed with the Multibit 2 was that it also just softens the attack on notes a little bit, and that's for better or worse. So things like a hit on a drum, the strum of a guitar, those transients, those leading edges are just a little tiny bit softer on the Multibit 2, which is not to say they're overall soft. It's not a soft, thick, warm sounding DAC, but it's a little bit more etched, a little bit more articulate. There's a greater sense of clarity, some might say, from the Modi Plus. And I'll talk about what that means and where it might be better or worse in just a moment. But one of the tracks where I really noticed the difference between these two was Everything by Passenger. As I listened to that track, what I noticed was that the orchestra that backs the main vocals and the acoustic guitar and sounds like that all sounded a bit richer and a bit fuller from the Modi Multibit 2. Whether that's better or worse, I'll leave up to you. But the sound of the Multibit 2 for me just had a bit more body and a bit more weight, whereas the sound from the Modi Plus was a bit more forward. It had a bit more sort of articulation, clarity you might call it, texture you might call it. But it came at the cost of it not feeling quite as full at times. Now I can't stress enough here that there's not a lack of warmth or body where there should be in the Modi Plus. It's not lean or sterile, but there is just a dash more of it in the Modi Multibit 2. And if you're having trouble contextualizing this and understanding what that means in the scheme of things, I've got comparisons coming up shortly, including something like the Topping E30 II and also the Geshelli J2 ESS version. So sit tight for those. But for now, what I'll say is that both of these DACs are very similar. They're not vastly different. Switching back and forth between the two, if you didn't know what you were listening to, you probably wouldn't pick which one was which. You'd just know they were a little bit different. And so ultimately, the biggest difference for me between them is actually more about that soundstage. It's that slightly different presentation of a more spherical and slightly deeper soundstage in the Modi Multibit 2 compared to a slightly flatter soundstage in the Modi Plus. And so before I get into some comparisons with different products outside the Schiit range, I just want to mention where I think these are going to work well. For me, the Modi Multibit 2 is possibly a better choice if you just want music playback, if you want it to be slightly more organic, you like that sense of soundstage depth and sphericality, if that's a word. That's where the Modi Multibit 2 could be a good choice. But then if we look at the Modi Plus, some people are going to love the fact that it's got a bit more texture, a bit more sense of clarity, and they're happy to forego the depth of the soundstage, which isn't a vast difference, I should add. As I played with both of these, in addition to music listening, I was also playing some games, and what I found was that I often leant towards the Modi Plus from a gaming point of view, because what it did was that it gave me a stronger sense of clarity, and that gave me a better sense of kind of the pinpoint locations of sounds within the gaming space. And I want to make it really clear, if you're listening to music and you want to critically listen, I think the Modi Multibit Plus gives you a better sense of depth in addition to left-right. But if you're purely looking for a sense of that left-right clarity in terms of which way do I need to turn to access the sound that I heard in a game, that's where I actually think the Modi Plus could be better. So for gamers out there, save yourself the money, get the Modi Plus. For those that are more looking for a pure, organic and natural musical experience, you may find there's benefit in spending extra on the Modi Multibit 2, but the difference is very minimal. And what that means is that a lot of people aren't going to see the benefit in spending the extra $100 and something to get the Modi Multibit 2, when the $129 Modi Plus is almost as good. And for some people, it's probably better. But before we close out the DAC conversation, let's do comparisons. And the first comparison that seemed obvious to me was the Topping E30 Mark II. The E30 Mark II retails for just a little bit more than the Modi Plus. I think it comes in at $149 from memory, so you've got about $20 difference. And as I went back and forth between the two of them, the sound was almost indistinguishable. I felt like maybe the Modi Plus had just a slight nuance to the sound. It had some things going on that were a bit intangible. I couldn't say it did this or that better or worse. It just seemed to me somehow to be a little bit more natural than the E30 II. If I had to summarize what I thought was different, I think the E30 II is probably just a little bit more flat in its sound, so there's less sense of any kind of depth in the E30 II compared to the Modi Plus. And I feel like it's also a bit more forward. It's a bit more, not forceful, but it's just a bit closer to you, a little bit more energetic. But we're talking about a 1% change here. And so I think either way, both are lovely DACs. But rather than spending $149 on the Topping, if you can get yourself a Modi Plus for the same price or less, I think it's a slightly better DAC than the E30 II. And that's the E30 Mark II. Don't go looking for an E3 II. It's the E30 Mark II. And so if you have both options available, choose the Modi Plus. If it's hard to get the Modi Plus where you are, or the prices are significantly different, don't feel like you're losing out buying the E30 Mark II. Both are excellent, but I'd give the edge ever so slightly to the Modi Plus by literally like 1 to 1.5%. And so I didn't go into much more detail with the Modi Plus. I then stepped on to the Geshelli Labs J2 ESS version, and I paused them because I had to think which version I was talking about. I've got the AKM version coming soon. I know there's a lot of hype around it. For those that are looking forward to that review, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out. It is coming soon. The Geshelli Labs J2s are priced at $299, and that makes them the same as the Multibit 2. But because they're both Delta Sigma DACs built on DAC chips, I figured it was actually a better comparison to start with at least, to put the J2 up against the Modi Plus. And so we've got the same $170 difference between the Modi Plus and the J2, and on this occasion I do think it's worth the extra money if you buy the J2. It was a little bit hard to test because the J2's output was a little bit higher, or if I reduced the gain it was a bit lower because it's got fixed gain levels. And so it did take a bit of fiddling to try to do the testing, but I'm still pretty confident in what I've heard, and that is that for me, the J2 is just a slightly stronger DAC. And what I'd say about the differences between them is that the same things I described about the E30 Mark II and the Modi Plus, that's now kind of flipped, and it's true of the Modi Plus versus the J2 ESS. And what I mean by that is the J2 ESS just gives you a little bit more of that kind of nuanced detail again. A tiny bit more sense of layering, a tiny bit better sense of naturalness in the sound, but they're once again very close. And so the reason I'm saying here that I think it's worth spending the extra money on the J2 is that the J2 is going to give you extra inputs, it's going to give you balanced outputs if you want them, it's just a more fully featured DAC. And so how I'd sum all this up is you've got the E30 Mark II sits at the bottom, and then by a tiny, tiny margin of maybe 1%, you've got the Modi Plus, and then by that same sort of tiny margin again, you've got the J2. So in the case of the J2, you're really spending the extra money on the extra outputs being the balanced, extra inputs because you've got an extra coaxial and optical input there. You've also got a full-size USB if that matters, being USB-B. And then what I'd do with the Modi Multibit 2 is kind of set it off to the side. Because the E30 Mark II, the J2 and the Modi Plus, those all sound almost indistinguishable. There are clear differences as I've just described, as each case as you go up those tiers I just mentioned, you're getting a slightly more natural sound, a slightly better sense of layering, a slightly better sense of kind of refinement in the sound. But they're all very, very similar. Whereas the Multibit 2 is just a little bit different. It's got that slightly smooth sense of transients, again very slight, and it gives you more sense of depth in the soundstage, but again very slight. And so for many people, there's no need to go past the Modi Plus. At $129, it's a brilliant little DAC. But for those that want to really dive into the music, I think the Modi Multibit 2 is excellent. And for those that want a more fully featured DAC, where you've got extra inputs and outputs, that's where the J2 comes in. And maybe the AKM version of the J2 will turn this all on its head, we'll wait and see. But for now, that's where I think the DACs sit. I know though that many of you out there are going to be screaming at me if I don't give you this next bit of information, and that's how does the Multibit 2 compare to the Bifrost 264? Obviously the Bifrost 264 is a huge jump. I think it's $500 off the top of my head. I haven't written it in my notes. It's a big jump up, but it's the next Multibit DAC in Schiit's range going up from the Multibit 2. And putting them side by side, you can definitely hear that they're built on the same foundation. The Multibit 2 and the Bifrost 264 are tonally almost identical. That said, the Bifrost 2, and I'm always talking about the 264 version, the Bifrost 2 resolves more texture, more fine detail. It's got a little bit more sense of kind of treble extension or clarity, I don't know what you'd want to call it. It's not a vast shift in tonality, but there is more treble detail there. The Bifrost 2 also gives you a much better sense of space between instruments compared to the Multibit 2. And so clearly for me straight away, as I went between them, I was seeing the benefit in spending more money. You're getting a much better DAC with the Bifrost 2 in my opinion. You're getting a better quality power supply. You're getting more space for more different circuitry. It is the better DAC. As I went back and forth between the two of these, one of the tracks I listened to was Tin Pan Alley by Stevie Ray Vaughan. And what I noticed was that the music's just somehow a bit more alive from the Bifrost 2. Things like the guitar have a sense of brightness to them and a sense of aliveness to them from the Bifrost 264 that the Modi Multibit 2 can't quite match. It's not that the Modi Multibit 2 is bad, but you can clearly hear why you're spending more money on the Bifrost. In that same track, Stevie Ray Vaughan's vocals are more focused, the image is more focused, the tonality is better. And things like the cymbals, I mentioned the guitar already, but things like the cymbals also have a little bit more shimmer. There's a bit more sense of that kind of upper end extension and detail, and that does start to make the Modi Multibit 2 sound just a little bit warm, but I don't want to overstress it here. It's not a big difference. And to extend that a bit further, what I'd say is that if you've got the Modi Multibit 2 and you're looking to upgrade to the Bifrost 264, don't expect to be blown away. So the difference isn't huge, but it's definitely significant, if that makes sense. And I say that and I clarify that for two reasons. Firstly, I don't want it to sound like the Multibit 2 is this rich, thick, muddy DAC and that the Bifrost 264 fixes all that. It's not the case. What it does is the Bifrost 2 unlocks a little bit more treble, a little bit more texture, a little bit more clarity, and that helps with all those imaging cues and things that I've mentioned. But the Multibit 2 is still on the same pathway. It's on the same continuum. And so you probably could say that maybe the Multibit 2 is 2 steps smoother than neutral, and the Bifrost 264 is 1 step smoother than neutral perhaps. And that depends on what neutral is. I'm just using that as a guidance as to how close these two are together. There's only a step between them, but it's a clear step that you can definitely hear. And so at this point, I am going to close off the DAC conversation. To summarize it to here, what I would say is, as I've already mentioned, I think the Modi Plus is fantastic. I think it's probably all that most people are going to need at this kind of level of performance. Anything up to, say, $300, where we start talking about the J2s, we're talking about the Modi Multibit 2 as well. If you don't want to spend $300, know that for $129, you're getting almost as much as what you're going to get for $300. But for those that want a more organic, natural, and musical presentation, that's where I think the Modi Multibit 2 is a really good choice. It does give you that slightly more natural sound, in my opinion, but it comes at a slight expense in terms of those treble details, that sense of energy in the treble and the transients in general. And so to then get that back in the multibit world, you're going to step up a full $500 to get to the Bifrost 2. And so that's the lay of the land in the Schiit DACs at this point, going with the Modi Plus, the Modi Multibit 2 and the Bifrost 264. Of course, I've got a whole bunch of other reviews, so check out my reviews on things like the Bifrost 264, how it compares to something like the Yggdrasil OG. I've also got the review of the Geshelli J2 ESS if you want that in more detail, so check all those out to get a better sense of context and how I view these different DACs if you want to. But for now, let's close off the DAC conversation and start talking amps. Moving over to the amps now, and I had a consistent setup for all of my testing here. Specifically what I did was I ran the Schiit Yggdrasil OG version because it's got 2 RCA outputs, and I ran a pair of RCAs to each of the amps I was testing. And that meant that I started off with a pair of Schiit Magnis, and then I did also throw in the Piety at the end just for some extra colour and flavour. The headphones I used for my specific critical listening were the Meza Elites, but I ran both of my amps on the desk for quite a while before writing any notes, and I've used them with a whole bunch of different headphones. And I can confirm they can drive anything and everything, and they sound great with anything and everything. But that doesn't mean they sound identical, so let's talk about now the Magni Plus and the Magni Heretic and how they compare and how they differ. One of the tracks I used for my listening was Lullaby by Benfolds 5. And the first thing I noticed, as I've already mentioned, is how great both amps sound. It really doesn't matter which one of these you buy, you're in for a good listen. However, when it comes to differences, the Magni Heretic brings the sound a bit more forward, and it brings a bit more energy and a bit more excitement at times to the music. It doesn't ever get harsh, but it is a slightly more aggressive, slightly more energetic sound. On the other hand, the Magni Plus, to me, sounds a bit more organic, a little tiny bit smoother, but not warm or rich. And it also provides a better sense of those spatial cues. And I mentioned this at the very beginning, where often the discrete designs handled the spatial cues better. For whatever reason, I'm not going to try and get into that here because it's already going to be a long review. But to me, the discrete design, once again, that being the Magni Plus, provides a better sense of depth and layering cues in the sound. So the Heretic tends to bring everything forward, make everything a little bit flatter, but it does therefore give you a greater sense of texture and detail and excitement sometimes. So it's going to come down to what you're looking for. There are going to be those that love the Heretic and those that love the Magni Plus. As I listened to Lullaby by Benfolds 5, what I found was that at around about 150 there's a piano solo and there's hand claps in it. And the Magni Plus was giving me a better sense of the depth, layering and positioning of the piano and the various hand claps. It laid out the soundstage in a more natural way. As I continued listening, the Heretic does come across a little tiny bit cooler than the Magni Plus, and some might call the Magni Plus a touch warm, but I don't find it overly warm or overly thick, just not quite as lean or neutral perhaps as the Heretic. It is worth noting that if you pair the Heretic up with a more analytical, more kind of clarity-based DAC, it could start to become a little bit too much depending on the headphones you're using, whereas I think the Magni Plus balances things out a little bit better. Keeping in mind that a lot of my testing started off with the Yggdrasil OG, and that's where we've got quite a punchy, full-sounding DAC paired up with the Magni Plus. That's where the Magni Plus probably started to sound a touch warm, whereas the Heretic was probably a little bit more on the leaner side and balanced off with the Yggdrasil better in terms of tonality. But as I listened to it with some other DACs as well, what I found was that when I had a leaner, cooler sounding DAC to start with, something like say the Chord Hugo TT2, that's where the Magni Heretic at times could get a little bit too dry or a little bit too lean for my personal taste at least. Whereas the Magni Plus actually managed that better. So maybe the Magni Plus is technically the more neutral one and the Heretic is a little bit lean. I'm going to leave that up to you to debate. But for me, I think both amps are great, and it just means you have to think about your preferences and your existing source chain as to whether you want the one that is slightly more organic, has a slightly more natural sense of soundstage, layout, space, depth, layering, etc., or whether you enjoy that sense of energy and attack, and you're happy to have something that can get a bit harsh on some systems. If that's more your cup of tea, then that's where the Heretic's going to be fantastic. And again, you can't go wrong with either of these. If you were to flip a coin and choose based on that, I guarantee you're going to be happy with what you hear. Both of these are fantastic amps, and I'm sort of splitting hairs to try to help you make decisions, but both are fantastic. Moving over to compare now the Magni Plus and the Piety, and what we had here was two discrete designs, but very differently tuned. At least I think the Piety is discrete. Correct me in the comments if I'm wrong on that one. But I wanted to compare the Magni Plus and the Piety because the Magni Plus was already the slightly warmer of the Heretic and the Magni Plus. And I knew already that the Piety was designed specifically to be a warmer, tubey sounding amp, even though it's got no tubes, it's all solid state. It was designed specifically to replicate tube sound. And comparing the Magni Plus with the Piety, and I continued using Lullaby because I was already used to that, comparing the two, the Piety is clearly a richer and smoother sounding amplifier. It's got body, it's got warmth to it, it's got what you'd expect for a tube replicating amplifier. Probably the most interesting thing though was that as I went back and forth between the Magni Plus and the Piety here, it was almost like the music was just a half a beat slower from the Piety. It wasn't that it was lacking in the ability to drive the headphones properly in terms of having good control of drivers and keeping things snappy, but something about the richer and fuller sound just felt like everything was slowed down a little bit. And I didn't necessarily like that, but I can also imagine some people loving that because it would make the listening experience more lush, more relaxing, more euphonic perhaps. So some people are going to love that, but it was a really interesting phenomenon. I've never noticed it before. Now to be clear, I'm not saying it actually is slowing down the music. That's not what it's doing. It was just a perception based on its tonality and the way it's presenting the sound. I think perhaps what was causing what I was perceiving was that I think the Magni Plus is a slightly tighter, punchier sound in the bass, and it also is slightly crisper with transients. And I think that's really what's going on. It's giving you a snappier sense of the rhythm, whereas I think the Piety is taking some of that away, and it's giving you that slightly smoother presentation instead. And that just changes how we perceive the timing and the rhythm and the attack of the transients. Now, I should make it clear, the Magni Plus and the Piety aren't vastly different beasts. It's not like you've got two completely different amps here. And realistically, what we've got here as I stack them up again, this is actually the perfect representation of how they sound from richer and fuller through more neutral and then going perhaps slightly into analytical territory. Or maybe this is truly neutral and then we've got one step towards warmth and then another step towards warmth. So they all clearly have the same general feel, the same general sound, but the Piety is the most full and most rich of the three. One of the ways that's achieved with the Piety is it's got what I would call a tasteful sense of bloom to the sound. The bass notes have a little bit of extra kind of lingering, sort of slower decay, and it just makes all the sound a little bit kind of bloomy, a little bit kind of, I don't know how to describe it without making it sound negative. It's not boomy, it's not flabby or loose, but it's definitely not quite as controlled, not quite as tight, and that could be for better or worse. The top end from the Piety, that being the treble I mean, is very smooth, but it doesn't ever get sloppy. It's very tube-like in that regard. And what I mean by that is it's not rolled off, it's not lacking in treble, but the treble's definitely a bit smoother than it is from something like the Magni Plus, or indeed definitely much smoother than something like the Heretic. And so as I listened to the three, what I found was that with a regular kind of neutral, natural sounding headphone, I would definitely prefer the Magni Plus would be my choice. And that's actually out of all three of these, the Magni Plus is my favourite. But the Piety for me had a place with a faster or more analytical or aggressive headphone. And not that I would call this headphone analytical or aggressive, but the very fast Verite Open that's got that very snappy, very quick decay, the Verite Opens worked beautifully with the Magni Piety. And so it is an amplifier that I can see working really well in some systems and some setups. But I'd say that for me overall, it wasn't an amp that actually caught my attention, that I particularly loved. I can see its place, but I think the Magni Plus is actually the perfect balance point. It gives you the organic nature of the sound without drifting too far into richness, fullness, or slowness even. And then the Heretic for me, whilst excellent, goes just a one step too far into that sense of analyticalness. And that's a preference thing. It's not a nasty, analytical, harsh amplifier. It's wonderful, and I can absolutely see a lot of people preferring its slightly more energetic sound. But that's not my personal taste. My personal tastes sit right there in the middle with the Magni Plus. And so hopefully I've been able to paint a good picture of how the three Schiit amps compare. But the final test I wanted to give you was to compare outside of the Schiit range. And so I thought I'd compare the Magni Heretic, being the integrated design using op amps, up against another integrated amp in the SMSL SH6. The SH6 retails for just $11 more than the Heretic, but other than that, they're quite similar amplifiers. For this test, I was again using the Yggdrasil OG, but because I already had the Verite Opens out from my Piety testing, I kept going with the Verite Opens. The track that I used for this test was Inflatable People by Lucas, and the first thing that stood out to me as I jumped between the SH6 and the Heretic was just how similar they sounded. Very, very similar sounding amps. Flipping back and forth between the two a few times, I started to hear some differences, and that is that for me, the SH6 is just a slightly smoother sounding amp compared to the Heretic. But what I found was that the Heretic separated things a little bit better. And so the soundstage is a little bit wider from the Heretic, and individual image placement and separation is a bit stronger from the Heretic as well. And I found it a little bit interesting that the Heretic, even though it is a slightly more kind of articulated, textured, clarity focused, sort of energetic style headphone amp, and we're talking slight here, but even though it's doing that, it's not resulting in what often happens with the slightly more energetic amps and flattening everything. What it's doing instead is actually giving me more sense of information and detail within the music. Only by a small margin, but the sense of separation, soundstage size, the sense of clarity from the Heretic, I was finding I preferred over the SH6. As I listen more and more, I think tonally I slightly prefer the SH6 from a tonal point of view. I like the fact that it's just a little bit smoother tonally. But if you ask me to choose between the two, I would definitely choose the Heretic. Because for me, that wider soundstage and the better image separation is absolutely worth it between those two. And that then comes back around to why I like the Magni Plus so much, because the Magni Plus gives me that slightly smoother presentation similar to the SH6, but it gives me much better sense of image separation, depth and layering. I shouldn't say much better, it gives me better separation and layering of the soundstage compared to the Heretic. And so again, much like I said in the review of the DACs from Schiit, I think the amplifiers here are also fantastic. Excellent value, excellent performance. I think either option anyone's going to be happy with. But it's really nice you've got the choice. You can go for the more kind of technical, analytical, maybe slightly aggressive sound, or let's not say aggressive, but energetic sound in the Heretic. Or you can go for the more layered, slightly more nuanced, and slightly smoother sound of the Magni Plus. Of course, for those of you that jumped in on the orders for the Piety when it was available, that brings you another flavour again for those that want that richer, smoother, warmer sound. But if you did miss out on the Piety, don't be too worried about it. I think the Magni Plus is giving you a really nice middle ground between the Heretic and the Piety that's in some ways the better all-rounder. The Piety, as I said before, is excellent if you've got a slightly faster or sharper sounding headphone, but the Magni Plus is going to be excellent as an all-rounder with pretty much anything. And so hopefully I've been able to clarify for you what each of these devices does well, which one's better for different situations, etc. If you have found the video useful, helpful, or just interesting, as always, I'd love it if you hit the like button and consider subscribing and ring the notification bell if you haven't already. And particularly remember to do that if you want to see the J2 AKM review. That one is coming. It's in the production queue over at Geshelli, and as soon as I get it, I'll be starting to write up my notes. So make sure you subscribe, stay tuned, but for now let me leave it in the music. So happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.